Abraham Lincoln is one of the most beloved presidents in our nation's history. His killer, John Wilkes Booth, and several others came up with a plan to kidnap the president and take him to the Confederate capital at Richmond, but this plan failed. The second attempt would come 5 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender to the Union at Appomattox Courthouse. After Booth learned that Lincoln was attending the performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April 14th, he decided to simultaneously assassinate President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William H. Seward. That night, Lincoln was seated in a private box above the stage with his wife Mary, a young Army officer named Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. At 10:15, Booth slipped into the box and fired his .44 caliber single-shot Derringer into the back of Lincoln's head. Booth then stabbed Rathbone in the shoulder and leapt onto the stage, breaking his leg with the fall. Then he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means, "thus ever to tyrants." Then he managed to leave the theater and escape from Washington on horseback. The attempts to kill the Vice President and Secretary of State failed, though the Secretary of State was injured. The President was officially pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. the next morning. As the nation mourned, Union soldiers were hot on the trail of John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice, David Harold. They followed them to Virginia. 26 Union troops surrounded the farmhouse where Booth and Harold were hiding and set fire to it. Harold surrendered, but Booth remained inside. Booth was shot in the neck and carried out of the building alive, but he died 3 hours later. Vice President Andrew Johnson stepped up to the presidency as Lincoln's successor. James A. Garfield was America's 20th president. The man who assassinated him was named Charles Guiteau. His family had thought him insane since 1875. He believed his efforts to be largely responsible for Garfield's victory in the presidential election of 1880 and deserving of reward. He obsessively loitered for a diplomatic position with no response and was eventually warned by then Secretary of State James G. Blaine never to ask for a position again. After this, Guiteau decided that he had been commanded by God to kill the president. He then purchased a .44 Webley British Bulldog revolver. Garfield was leaving for a summer vacation on July 2, 1881. That day, Guiteau was waiting for him at the railway station. When Garfield entered the waiting room, Guiteau stepped out and shot the president from behind. Guiteau fired a second time and Garfield collapsed. The assassin then turned to leave but was apprehended by a policeman. One bullet remained in Garfield's body that the doctors could not find. The doctors told him that he would not survive, but he continued to be conscious and alert. Through the summer, the president's condition fluctuated. In August, Garfield became increasingly ill and lost over 200 pounds. September 6th, Garfield was taken to the Jersey Shore in hopes that the fresh air would be good for him, but infections continued. On September 19, 1881, President Garfield died. Vice President Chester Arthur became president following Garfield's death. Guiteau claimed not guilty by reason of insanity at his trial, but was eventually convicted of murder and hung. William McKinley was the 25th President of the United States. In 1901, he had just won his second term. Leon Czolgosz had lost his job in the economic downturn of the Panic of 1893. In trying to understand it, he turned to anarchism. Czolgosz saw President McKinley as the embodiment of injustice. September 6, 1901, President McKinley was visiting the Temple of Music during his second day at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. During this time, Czolgosz came up to the president with his .32 Iver Johnson revolver that he had hidden under a handkerchief in his hand. He then shot the president in the abdomen. Before Czolgosz could get a third shot, he was stopped by the man behind him in line and within seconds was taken into custody. The president was then operated on by a doctor who was not very experienced with that type of injury. At first, McKinley seemed to be recovering, but due to the lack of experience of the surgeon, he had contracted gangrene. The morning of September 14, 1901, President McKinley died. Leon Czolgosz was convicted of murder and sentenced to execution by electric chair. President McKinley's successor was his Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States. His assassination is one of the great mysteries in our country's history. He was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. It is suspected that he acted with co-conspirators, but if he did, they remain unknown to this day. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was visiting Texas to raise money for the Democratic Party. President Kennedy was seated with his wife Jacqueline in the back seat of the presidential limousine, a 1961 Lincoln Continental. The motorcade reached Dealey Plaza at 12:29. This would be the last minute of Kennedy's life. At 12:30, shooting began. 3 shots were heard and the president was hit twice. The first hit was in the back and the second in the head. President Kennedy was pronounced dead at the hospital at 1 p.m. after all brain activity had ceased.